Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel! This week I'm covering a case that was specially requested, but also one that is extremely fitting for my movie mystery series, so thank you very much for that recommendation. This week we're going to be covering the suspicious death of Hollywood actress Natalie Wood on Thanksgiving weekend of 1981. This case was originally closed and ruled as an accident for many years after it occurred. But in 2011 it was reopened when new witnesses came forward, with their statements suggesting that it may not have been an accidental death after all. Also, just to let you know, if you have any cases you'd like me to cover, movie mysteries or not, then please do comment them down below. I am here to please after all. Anyway, let's jump into it. Natalia Zakarenko, or Natalie Wood as she was later known, was born July 20th, 1938 in San Francisco, California, to Nikolai Zakarenko and Maria Zdalova. Sorry if I absolutely butchered those surnames there. The two were Russian immigrants whose family backgrounds are kind of unclear. Natalie's mother, Maria, was known to tell a lot of stories and emphasise parts of her life to make her seem like she was from a kind of elevated, high-class background, despite the fact that the family themselves lived a relatively normal, quite working-class life before Natalie became famous. She would often tell Natalie that she was related to the Romanovs, who, if you don't know, were the reigning imperial house of Russia from 1613 to 1917, basically like the rulers of Russia, and the entire family was executed by communist revolutionaries in 1918. This brutal massacre caused Maria and her family to flee Russia, eventually settling down in the city of Harbin in China. In later years, Natalie would describe her family as having been either land-owning Russian aristocrats or as travelling folk. Natalie's mother Maria had always dreamed of becoming an actress. Unable to achieve that dream for herself, like so many parents out there, Maria passed this ambition along to her daughter Natalie. Though the family didn't have a lot of money, Maria would always make sure they could afford to take young Natalie to the cinema as often as they could. Natalie later recalled that her mother would tell her that the cameraman who pointed his lens out at the audience at the end of the Paramount newsreel was taking her picture. I'd pose and smile like he was going to make me famous or something. I believed everything my mother told me. Around 1943, Maria moved the family from San Francisco to Santa Rosa. Though they couldn't really afford the move, and it meant Natalie's father Nikolai had to look for a new job, Maria had heard about the fate of a certain young Santa Rosa girl, and she wanted that same story for her daughter. It was all over the papers at the time. Edna Mae Wonnacott, a 9-year-old girl just waiting at the bus stop, when who should spot her? Hollywood film producer Jack H. Skirball, and none other than Alfred Hitchcock himself. At the time, Hitchcock was searching for a young girl to play the character of Anne Newton in his film Shadow of a Doubt. Edna was perfect for it, and despite the fact that she'd never had an ounce of training or experience, not even in the school's theatre department, Edna was immediately a star. After completing the film, she was offered a 7-year contract with the studio and featured in 6 more films, although she was uncredited for almost all of these performances. Edna, however, retired from acting in 1952 and never became the household name Hitchcock predicted she would be. This was 1943, however, and at the time, Edna's discovery was all anyone was talking about, especially in Santa Rosa. I mean, it's literally like something from a book or a film. You're standing there, minding your own business, when suddenly one of the most famous directors in the entire world comes over to you and tells you he wants to make you a star. It's the olden day equivalent of Harry Styles catching you reading a book at his concert and thinking you're not like other girls. Maria was desperate for Edna's story to be Natalie's. She would scour the newspapers every day looking for any news of Hollywood movies shooting nearby. Then she'd drag 4-year-old Natalie along with her, stand around the shoot all day and encourage little Natalie to do certain things in an attempt to catch the director's attention. And surprisingly enough, it worked. In 1943, a few weeks before her 5th birthday, Natalie secured her first role in Irving Peschel's Happyland by doing just this scheme. Maria, after overhearing that Peschel was looking for a young girl for a small role in his film, encouraged Natalie to go over to the director, sit in his lap, and tell him how she's always wanted to be an actress. Peschel took one look at Natalie and knew she was just the girl he was looking for, and she was given the part immediately. Though Natalie was only in that one shot, dropping her ice cream on the ground, and her face wasn't even visible, this glimpse into the life of a Hollywood star spurred Maria on even more. She was going to make Natalie the star she had always wanted to be herself. In June 1944, despite the better judgment of literally everyone else, Maria upped and moved the whole family once again. this time to Los Angeles. She wanted Natalie to be closer to all the Hollywood studios, sending her off on as many auditions as she could, hoping she would finally get that big break. And she did. In 1946, at 7 years old, Natalie got her first proper Hollywood role as a German orphan in Tomorrow is Forever, opposite Orson Welles and Claudette Colbert. If you're not a big old movie fan, then trust me, those are some big name actors. Orson Welles a few years earlier had directed and starred in Citizen Kane, which for many years was regarded as the best film ever made. That was until 2005 when the animated masterpiece Hoodwinked, starring Anne Hathaway and Glenn Close, was released. Use the hood, Red. Use the hood. Natalie was paid $100 a week for her role in Tomorrow is Forever, which is the equivalent of around $1,300 a week in today's world. As a 7-year-old. Natalie's mother didn't just stop with sending her daughter to auditions. She wanted to make sure that Natalie was completely professional, did everything the director asked of her, and never, ever complained. The story goes that Natalie experienced some problems with one scene in particular. For this scene, Natalie was required to hysterically cry, but she was having real problems doing it. Natalie was only 7 years old, and with the excitement of being on a real movie set, around super famous actors, and the director Irving Pichel, who she hadn't seen since Happyland, it's not really surprising that she wasn't able to cry on cue. Maria, however, was not happy about this. She was not going to risk Natalie getting recast, all because she couldn't do something as simple as crying on cue. And so, she took Natalie aside, pulled out a jar with a live butterfly in it, and proceeded to rip the butterfly to pieces right in front of her. Natalie, who was a huge animal lover, immediately burst into tears at the sight of this creature's brutal death, and Maria quickly ushered her back onto the set, shouting that Natalie was now ready for another take. This story of Maria basically emotionally abusing Natalie is sadly just one of many. In 1947, Natalie secured the role which would launch her into stardom. This film was the Christmas classic Miracle on 34th Street, in which Natalie plays Susan Walker, a young girl who believes the main character, Kris Kringle, played by Edmund Gwenn, is the real Santa Claus. At the time of filming Miracle on 34th Street, Natalie was actually working on 2 other productions, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir and Scudda Hoo, Scudda Hey, which also features Marilyn Monroe in one of her very first roles, although it's only a small bit part. Natalie would have to fly back and forth between different locations for each film, learning 3 different sets of lines, playing 3 completely different characters, all whilst having to do her designated hours of schooling. She wasn't even 10 years old yet, and she was working just as much, if not more, than most adult actors. Natalie later said that all of this work from such a young age was what led to her suffering with an identity crisis. At a time when she was supposed to be developing her own personality, Natalie was forced to become so many different people. In Miracle on 34th Street, she was a cynical American girl. In The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, she plays Anna Muir, a little British child. In Scudda Hoo, Scudda Hey, she plays Euphrasie Bean McGill, a Midwestern farm girl. Miracle is a family film, Mrs. Muir more of a romance, and Scudda Hoo a comedy. For a young child, this was incredibly confusing. All at once, Natalie was expected to be all these different people. Natalie herself said, "I was playing so many of these parts, I had a hard time finding me." Instead of forming her personality around her life or her friends or family, parts of each character she played would become a permanent part of who she was. In 1949, whilst filming for The Green Promise, Natalie's mother Maria once again displayed behaviour worthy of a Mother of the Year award. For one particular scene, 10-year-old Natalie had to walk across a bridge, with a river of rushing water underneath it. Natalie was absolutely terrified to film this scene. From a very young age, Maria had instilled a fear of water in Natalie, so much so that for much of her childhood, Natalie was too scared to even wash her hair. The story goes that before Natalie was even born, Maria had met with a fortune teller. The fortune teller told her that she would have one child who would become incredibly famous, but that Maria should be wary of deep, dark water, because somebody was going to drown. Not specifically Natalie or Maria or either of her other 2 children, just somebody within the family. Because of this, both Natalie and Maria were terrified of drowning. Neither Natalie nor her younger sister Svetlana ever learned how to swim. Svetlana, by the way, would later become known as Lana Wood, and was an actress herself, playing the Bond girl Plenty O'Toole in 1971's Diamonds Are Forever. Having a debilitating fear of water and filming a scene over a river would obviously be terrifying for a young Natalie. Now, different sources say ever so slightly different things regarding this story. Some say that Natalie was unaware that the bridge had been deliberately rigged to collapse, but that Maria did know and had not told her daughter about it, simply saying it would all be fine and she had nothing to worry about. And others say that the bridge actually collapsed too early and Natalie wasn't supposed to be on it when it broke. I suppose both of those stories could be true, it could just be an amalgamation of the two, but I'm not sure. Either way, whilst Natalie was still performing on the bridge, it collapsed underneath her. She held on to what was left of the bridge for dear life, and, though she was clearly in some pain, she continued her scene like nothing was wrong. The director loved it. After they'd finished, Maria pulled Natalie aside and realised that she had actually broken her wrist in the fall. She told Natalie that she was not to say anything to anybody about it, and that they would deal with it at home. Maria was terrified that if Natalie showed anyone that she had been injured, the studio would just recast her instead of waiting for her to recover. Maria never, in fact, dealt with it at home. Natalie was not taken to a medical professional and her wrist did not heal correctly. For the rest of her life, Natalie would always wear a bangle or cuff-style bracelet over that wrist to hide the fact that the bone was protruding outwards. Lana Wood described how their mother's overbearing personality turned both her and Natalie into pleasers. They would accept every hardship life threw at them because they were so terrified of letting people down. And it worked. Among the Hollywood elites, young Natalie became known as One Take Natalie, one of the most cooperative and professional young actresses in Hollywood. While she was filming Walter Lang's The Jackpot in 1950, young Natalie was walking through the studio's corridor when she passed a man who caught her eye. This man was fellow actor Robert Wagner, also known as RJ, who at the time was about 20 years old. He was dressed as a Marine as he was also working in the studio, filming a war movie. I'm not sure exactly what movie it was, as Wagner actually appeared in 2 movies that were released in 1951 that were both about Marines and were both distributed by 20th Century Fox. It was either The Frogmen or Halls of Montezuma. Either way, his role in both films was relatively small, as he was just in the process of building his career. The story goes that young Natalie took one look at RJ, turned to her mother and said, "I'm going to marry that man one day." This was a dream that Natalie never gave up on, pursuing him until her 18th birthday years later. Things began to get a little bumpy in Natalie's career when she hit around 12 to 13 years of age. You see, she'd hit that kind of problem age. She looked far too old to play a little girl anymore, but she didn't look old enough to play an adult. At this time, teenagers in film weren't really a big thing. They would sometimes appear, but they would never be the main focus or the main character of a movie. And Natalie was far too well known to just start playing background characters. But Natalie wasn't going to give up on her Hollywood movie career that quickly. And neither was her mother Maria, that's for sure. She wanted to age up, start working on more mature characters. But there was a problem. Audiences were only used to seeing Natalie play little children, innocent little girly roles. If she all of a sudden started playing some kind of raunchy adult roles, people were not going to buy into it whatsoever. And so the studio had to make a plan. A plan which for the time was very successful, but would definitely be very dodgy if it happened today. The studio started setting her up on fake dates with other actors on their books. I suppose they were kind of more like appearances. Natalie would get taken along as somebody's date to a movie premiere, or they would go out to dinner together so that the paparazzi could photograph them and write some gossipy story about whether or not the two were dating. But here's where it gets very dodgy. You see, it's not like they were setting Natalie up with fellow child actors. Maybe someone who was around 14 to 15 years old. No. They were setting her up with adult men. Fully grown men. At 13 years old, Natalie's public boyfriend was an actor called Tom Irish, who at the time was 21 years of age. He always maintained that they never actually did anything illegal, but Maria would allow Natalie to go out with this man completely unchaperoned. Actors that she was friends with or dating at this age would say that it wasn't weird going out with Natalie, because she didn't act like she was that young. She had grown up around adults all her life. She'd been on movie sets since she was around 5 years old. This apparently made her mature enough to date fully grown adult men while she was barely even into her teenage years. This scheme the studio put together did work as planned for Natalie's career though. At age 16, Natalie was offered the part of Judy in Nicholas Ray's Rebel Without a Cause. Natalie's family were completely against her taking the part. It wasn't going to be an easy role. The film was a drama focusing on the lives of a group of emotionally confused suburban middle-class teenagers. Most films with teenagers at the time, as I mentioned, never really focused on what it was truly like to be a teenager in a time of such societal shift. The film focused on the dramatic shift in values between the younger generation and their parents, and how rebelling against the norm affects the youth. Natalie had never played a part like that before. Unsurprisingly, there weren't a lot of parts for child actors that were that deep or philosophical. Maria did not think it was worth the risk. If Natalie couldn't perform this part well, it could affect her chances of ever getting any roles again, even relatively easy ones. And then who would support the family? By this point though, Natalie herself had hit her rebellious teenage years, and if she wanted this role, she was going to go for it. She later said that this was the first role that she actually wanted to do, as opposed to being told to do it. Once again though, we've got another case of a young girl being taken advantage of by big Hollywood professionals. Before shooting Rebel Without a Cause and during production, 16-year-old Natalie was having an affair with the director, Nicholas Ray, who was in his mid-40s. He took complete advantage of her by, allegedly, making her think that if she slept with him, she would be guaranteed the only role she had ever actually wanted to do herself. And then, after she did so, he told her, "Oh no, you still need to audition, and you might not actually get the part." Natalie was nominated for her first Oscar, Best Supporting Actress, for her role in the film. In November of 1954, Natalie signed to famous big-name agent Henry Wilson. Wilson was known for starting the beefcake craze in film. Beefcakes are basically big, muscly, tanned, six-pack abs, shirtless guys. It was pretty much the male equivalent of pin-up girls. It was pretty common knowledge in Hollywood that Henry Wilson was gay, which, according to actress Anne Duran, meant if a young, handsome actor had Henry Wilson for an agent, it was almost assumed he was gay, like it was written across his forehead. Suzanne Finstead, the author of a Natalie Wood biography, wrote that some of the would-be actors Wilson represented were heterosexual, but a disproportionate number were homosexual, bisexual, or cooperated with Wilson to get gigs, meaning that some of his talent would be coerced into sexual relationships with him just so he would put them up for jobs. What a lovely man. I know that information may seem irrelevant now, but trust me, it will come into play later. And also, I think anyway, it's a good thing to mention because people don't often talk about how men can also get used and abused in Hollywood, and it does happen. Natalie signed to Henry Wilson for one very particular reason. Robert Wagner, the man she had set her sights on marrying at 10 years old, was also signed to him. Natalie asked him to set her up on a date with RJ, but Wilson refused, saying she would have to wait until she was 18. I was going to give him some credit for being a bit responsible here, but honestly, I don't think he deserves it. It wasn't until 2001, when author Suzanne Finstead released Natalie's biography, that more details about what Natalie went through as a teenager in Hollywood were released. Trigger warning here, I'm going to be talking about rape and sexual assault, so if you want to skip this part of the story, then skip to this time. Through the recollection of some of Natalie's close friends, and later on her own sister, Lana Wood, Finstead wrote about how Natalie was brutally raped by a fellow big-name actor at 16 years old. Natalie had been asked to go to an audition at the Chateau Marmont Hotel. Her mother and her sister Lana sat in the car outside for hours, so long that young Lana actually fell asleep. Lana said she was never actually told about the incident, but had figured it out many years later when she overheard a conversation between her parents. All she could remember was that when Natalie got back in the car, she was incredibly upset, and that her mother had told her that they weren't to say anything about it, and Natalie never did. Though she did tell a few of her very close friends, she never went public with her accusations, out of fear that it would damage her career. Over the years, however, many people have speculated about who this actor was. According to Natalie's friends, she hated her former screen idol afterwards, would shudder when she heard his name, and refused to ever work with him. According to an article published by Gawker in 2012, on the celebrity gossip blog Crazy Days and Nights, someone had come forward in the comments of a post to allege that Natalie's rapist was actor Kirk Douglas, known for films such as Spartacus, Gunfight at the OK Corral, and Paths of Glory. The commenter, who went by the name Him, had gained a lot of credit among frequenters of the blog for his accurate knowledge. Many people speculate that this commenter is in fact Robert Downey Jr., as the commenter has made statements about working with actor Ryan O'Neal, and the two starred in the movie Chances Are together in 1989, and he also mentioned that he had worked with Natalie Wood's daughter, Natasha Gregson, and apparently provided her correct home phone number to prove it. They both starred in Two Girls and a Guy in 1998. I'm unable to put actual screenshots of what this anonymous account posted, because according to the links I found, it seems that all the comments on the post have since been removed, but I will share the transcript of the post from Gawker's article. I know I've already given a trigger warning, but I will give another one now because what he writes is very, very graphic. The poster also alleges that this actor had heard about Natalie's affair with Rebel director Nicholas Ray, and believed she would be willing to have sex with him to get a part because of it. Kirk Douglas was, for most of his career, widely disliked in Hollywood. In his own memoir, The Ragman's Son, published in 1988, he wrote, "I'm probably the most disliked actor in Hollywood, and I feel pretty good about it, because that's me. I was born aggressive, and I guess I'll die aggressive. In that same book, Douglas wrote about how he would often take his anger out on women. He also openly admitted to cheating on both of his wives. His second wife was apparently completely fine with it, saying that, as a European, I understood it was unrealistic to expect total fidelity in a marriage. What? Kirk Douglas was also connected to the suspicious death of an actress called Jean Spangler in 1949. On October 7th, 1949, Jean Spangler left her home in Los Angeles around 5 p.m, telling her sister-in-law Sophie that she was going to meet with her ex-husband and then had to do a night shoot for a film. When she didn't return the following morning, she was reported missing. It turned out that Jean was not scheduled to work on any film that night, and her ex-husband and his new wife both corroborated that they hadn't seen her for several weeks. 2 days later, on October 9th, Jean's purse was found in Griffith Park, around 5.5 miles away from her home. Inside was a note addressed to Kirk, which read, "Kirk, can't wait any longer, going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while Mother is away." At the time, Jean's mother was out of town visiting family. Well, it turned out that at the time of her disappearance, Jean had just finished filming a bit part in a film called Young Man with a Horn, which was starring none other than Kirk Douglas himself. Douglas was later interviewed by police via telephone and admitted that he had talked and kidded with Jean a bit on set, but that he had never spent any time with her outside of the film production. Jean's friends told police that Jean had been 3 months pregnant when she disappeared, and had spoken to them about having an abortion. Witnesses who frequented the same bars and nightclubs as Jean told police that they had heard of a former medical student called Doc, who was performing illegal abortions, but police were never able to prove the existence of this person. Jean had also told her friend, actor Robert Cummings, that she was having a casual affair at the time, but she never told him who this man was. Many people speculate that Kirk Douglas had had an affair with Jean, she'd fallen pregnant, and then died whilst having an illegal abortion. Obviously, this is all alleged, but you have to admit that there is a reason to suspect a connection. This doesn't connect directly with Natalie Wood, however. Well, as her friends mentioned, Natalie refused to ever work with this actor, despite the fact that he was a very big name, and a film with him would have probably helped boost her career. In Suzanne Finstead's biography, she quotes one of Natalie's friends as saying, "How can this man live with himself?" The use of the present tense here would indicate that this actor was still alive at the time of the book's publication in 2001. One film we know Natalie turned down for personal reasons was the 1959 film The Devil's Disciple. The film had 3 male leads: Kirk Douglas, Burt Lancaster, and Laurence Olivier. Lancaster died in 1994 and Olivier in 1989, meaning that the only star still alive at the time Finstead's book was published was Kirk Douglas. Once again, there's no direct proof of all this, it is just alleged, but many people have accepted it as the truth. On Natalie's 18th birthday, her childhood wish was fulfilled. She finally got her date with Robert Wagner to the premiere of his film The Mountain. By this point, however, Natalie wasn't really interested in RJ anymore. She wasn't really looking for that kind of cookie-cutter, surface-level actor. The studio had arranged this date with RJ though, and after all, she had signed with Henry Wilson specifically to get set up with RJ, so it was only fair that she make the date. 5 months after they had been originally set up by the studio, Natalie bumped into Robert Wagner at an after-party. This time, the two hit it off, and Robert asked Natalie out on a proper date, which, ironically enough for the rest of this story, was on his sailboat called My Lady. 1 year after their first real date, on December 6th, 1957, RJ took Natalie out to dinner at a restaurant called, funnily enough, Romanovs, where he proposed to her with a diamond ring in her champagne glass. Natalie accepted, and the two were married in Scottsdale, Arizona on December 28th. Natalie was now 19 years old and RJ 27. Though publicly, Natalie and RJ were Hollywood's dream couple, behind the scenes, things were more of a nightmare. After marrying RJ, Natalie's career had gone from strength to strength, but the same could not be said of RJ's. He was finding it increasingly more difficult to get any acting jobs, and having to watch his wife becoming more and more successful was embarrassing for him. RJ himself, in his own memoir, Pieces of My Heart, admitted to being an incredibly jealous person, and Lana Wood recalled how once Natalie had asked him where they should all go for dinner. He had replied, "Well, you're the star, so you should decide." In 1961, Natalie starred in Splendor in the Grass, alongside star on the rise Warren Beatty. According to reports, Warren and Natalie did not get on at first, which made the love scenes between them feel incredibly awkward and unnatural. One day, however, everything suddenly changed. Now Natalie and Warren were the best of friends, laughing and joking around with one another on set. One story even even told that Warren would show up to set with his arm around Natalie's waist. And surprisingly, rumours quickly spread that Natalie and Warren were having an affair. Though they did end up dating for a short period of time later on, Natalie always steadfastly denied ever having an affair, as she was very against adultery. RJ, in his own memoir, talks about this period of time, and though he says that he never believed Natalie was having an affair, he was still incredibly jealous and flew out to the set to go check up on them. He even admitted that he once followed Warren Beatty home and sat outside of his house with a loaded gun. Though he did say that he knew he never would have gone through with it, it's a brilliant example of just how insanely jealous Robert Wagner is. On June 29th, 1961, RJ and Natalie announced that they were separating, and 10 months later, their divorce was finalised. The two never explicitly spoke about why they had decided to separate, although allegedly Natalie cited mental cruelties as the official reason. In a podcast called Fatal Voyage, Lana Wood came forward to say what had really happened between the couple. According to Lana, Natalie awoke one night to find that RJ wasn't in bed with her. She went downstairs to go and look for him and found him on the sofa, going to town with another man, apparently their butler/housekeeper. Natalie was fuming, immediately left the house and went to go and stay with her family. This is where a lot of people cite RJ's affiliation with Agent Henry Wilson as being important. As I mentioned, Wilson worked with a lot of closeted gay actors, so it wouldn't really be that surprising if Robert Wagner was one of them. In episode 4 of the Fatal Voyage podcast, many different Hollywood insiders discuss how Robert Wagner was very, very manipulative and calculating with the way he gained his fame. He would hang around with the right people, he would switch his personality up depending on who he was with, so as to best please different people. He would always remember one small detail about each important person, so that they remembered him. Apparently, this is exactly what happened with him and Natalie. When they had their first date set up by the studio, RJ was loud and cocky, not someone Natalie would be interested in, but he realised that that wasn't the type of guy she liked, and so he changed and became more reserved and brooding. Many people, including in the Fatal Voyage podcast, speculate if RJ's marriage to Natalie was just a facade. He thought it was just another thing he should do to build his career, and when it didn't work, the marriage soured, since he had no interest in her other than that. This is all just speculation though, although I would be more inclined to believe that what Lana Wood said about the couple's breakup is true, since she did actually see Natalie right after it ended. On May 30th, 1969, Natalie remarried to the English film producer Richard Gregson, after dating for 3 years. On September 29th, 1970, Natalie gave birth to her first child, Natasha Gregson, who, as I mentioned, also later became an actress. This marriage, however, also soured for very similar reasons. Allegedly, Natalie caught Gregson cheating on her. Some say she overheard a very not safe for work phone call between Gregson and his secretary. Others say she returned home and caught the two in bed together. Natalie kicked him out immediately, filing for divorce on the 4th of August 1971, which was finalised by the following April. By this time, Robert Wagner had also remarried and then divorced again to an actress called Marion Marshall. In 1964, the couple had a child, whom they called Catherine, Katie for short, who now works as a Hollywood reporter and also hosts an online radio show with a psychic medium called In a View with Katie and Vox. Marion and RJ divorced in 1971. Around Christmas time of 1972, Natalie invited her family around and surprised them all with some big news. Her and RJ had once again reunited. Lana, as you can imagine, was not best pleased about this. After all, she had been there for Natalie when the two had split the first time. She knew all about what had happened between them. Why on earth would either of them want to get back together again? Maria, however, did not share these same concerns. When Lana asked her what she thought, Maria responded that RJ had since been cured of his homosexuality. Not possible, Queen, but go off. When confronted by Lana, Natalie's response on why she had decided to reconcile with RJ was simply, "Better the devil you know than the devil you don't." Natalie knew RJ was a devil, not a good man, but she was so terrified of being alone that she would rather be with him than risk never being with anyone. On July 16th, 1972, Natalie and RJ married for a second time, on board their friend's yacht called the Ramblin' Rose off the coast of Malibu. Their honeymoon was a month-long cruise. You see, though Natalie was still deathly afraid of water, she was more afraid of being in the water rather than being on it. And most of the happiest times in her relationship with RJ would take place on boats. Their first dates, their second marriage, their honeymoon. She was able to put aside that fear to enjoy some happy moments with RJ. And so, in 1975, the couple bought their own 60-foot luxury yacht called the Splendor, after one of Natalie's most successful films, Splendor in the Grass. The 13-foot inflatable dinghy attached to it, they named the Valiant, after one of RJ's not-so-successful films, Prince Valiant. I suppose it's an ironic little joke, but knowing how jealous RJ was of Natalie's success during their first marriage, this kind of seems like a weird backhanded move to me. Not only that, but why would you name your boat after the film that was one of the main causes of mistrust in your first marriage? During their second marriage, the roles had completely reversed. RJ was no longer the struggling actor. He had since gained notoriety as the star of the successful TV show Heart to Heart. Natalie fell pregnant with her second child, Courtney, who was born in 1974, and decided to take a break to focus on raising her family. When she was ready to get back to acting, she was not being offered the same calibre of parts as before, which was extremely frustrating for her. Though the dynamic in their relationship had now changed to something which, I would argue, was probably far more satisfactory for RJ, there was still some tension there. You see, though RJ had gained incredible notoriety, it was still only on TV. In Hollywood at the time, there was a hierarchy between film and TV, and if you were a film star, you were considered far more high calibre of an actor than someone who just worked on TV. TV was considered like a last resort for an actor, which is so crazy for me because TV is a guaranteed long-haul job, whereas film actors can drop in and out of work all the time. But TV was not considered to be a highbrow style of acting. Eventually, Natalie was offered the part which she thought was exactly what she needed to rebuild her career again. It was the leading female role in a science fiction film called Brainstorm, directed by up-and-comer Douglas Trumbull. Her co-star would be none other than Christopher Walken, who at the time was riding high, having just won an Oscar for his performance in The Deer Hunter. This was exactly the kind of people Natalie wanted to be working with. Natalie accepted the offer, and in September 1981, shooting began in North Carolina. Natalie and Walken got on incredibly well. They had brilliant chemistry on and off screen. Natalie admired Walken's acting style and his dedication to the role, and their friendship was nothing more than that. A friendship. Once again, however, rumours somehow began to circulate that Natalie and Walken had begun a not-so-secret affair. These rumours managed to spread all the way back to RJ and Walken's wife, both of whom flew up to North Carolina to check what the hell was going on. It was a repeat of Splendor in the Grass all over again. Allegedly, while shooting Brainstorm, Natalie began confessing to friends and family, including her on-set hairstylist, that RJ had begun drinking very heavily, and it was seriously affecting their marriage. After 6 weeks of shooting in North Carolina, the cast and crew returned back to Culver City, California. The film was almost complete. All that was left was to shoot the interior scenes in the nearby MGM studios. By this point, it was coming up to be Thanksgiving weekend, so the cast and crew were given a little time off for the holidays. Chris Walken, however, did not have any family nearby, and was all set to spend Thanksgiving on his own, in his hotel room. Natalie would not allow this. She loved the holidays and always valued the time she spent with her family and friends, and so she invited him to celebrate with her family. Natalie and RJ had decided that the day after Thanksgiving, the Friday, they would head out to Catalina Island on their boat, the Splendor. Their marriage was once again on the rocks, it seemed, and as I mentioned, some of their happiest moments had been out on the sea. Maybe a trip out on the boat was all they needed. The couple very rarely went out on the boat with just the two of them. Usually they would bring along their children or some friends, and they would always be accompanied by the boat's captain, a man called Dennis Taverne. This time was not unusual. They had already invited their friend, apparently a real estate agent, to join them, so Natalie thought she should ask Christopher Walken too. Walken happily accepted. When Dennis Taverne heard that the couple wanted to take the boat out that weekend, he was extremely confused. The weather was meant to be absolutely awful. It was late November, it was freezing, not the ideal weather for boating at all. And the couple's real estate friend also seemed to realise this because she also cancelled on them. What was the point of going out on the boat if the weather wasn't nice outside? Dennis told Natalie this, and even her own family, including her 11-year-old daughter Natasha, warned her that it was a terrible idea. But Natalie insisted. They were going to go out on the boat that weekend, no matter what. Some question why on earth Natalie would invite Christopher Walken on a boating trip with just her and her husband, when she very well knew that her husband had jealousy issues and that he already suspected that she was cheating on him with Walken. Some use this as proof that Natalie was in fact having an affair, although I can't imagine that a boating trip with your husband would be the best place to carry this out. Others suspect, however, that Natalie had actually invited Walken along because she suspected that RJ himself was having an affair with his heart-to-heart co-star Stephanie Powers. Her sole intent that weekend was to piss RJ off. Either way, we'll never really know for sure. The trio, along with the boat captain Dennis Taverne, had decided to head out to Santa Catalina Island, just off the coast of Los Angeles. The island was a popular tourist spot, particularly for celebrities. When they first boarded the boat, Dennis recalled how RJ was showing off to Christopher Walken, showing him around the boat and pointing at things and explaining what they did. almost as if he was saying, "Look at me, I'm a big success with my boat." Dennis explained how, from the very minute they stepped onto the boat that weekend, the atmosphere was incredibly uncomfortable. Around 12 p.m. on that Friday, the 27th of November, the group set sail for Avalon, Catalina Island's only city. Throughout the day, everything seemed to be fine. The group went shopping together and then headed over to the El Galeon restaurant to get some food and drinks. According to witnesses, the group didn't really eat much, but did drink a whole lot of alcohol. The tension between them all was clear, especially when an argument started up. A rainstorm had started up outside and RJ wanted to move the boat to somewhere more sheltered, like Isthmus Cove. Apparently, Natalie didn't want to move the boat as she wanted to continue drinking and partying in the restaurant, as she'd had a tough few weeks filming and wanted to unwind. When the group eventually left the restaurant that evening, they were all very drunk. The arguing did not stop once they got back onto the boat, however. In fact, it got so bad that Natalie asked Dennis if he could escort her ashore on the dinghy because she couldn't bear to spend the night on the Splendor. Dennis agreed and the two checked into a local motel, into rooms 126 and 219. Dennis, however, never even walked into his room. The next morning, when the maids went in to clean it, they could see that no one had slept in that room all night. Dennis claimed that he and Natalie had sat up in her motel room all night drinking. The two had become very close friends over the years. He was always with them whenever they went out on the boat, and as Natalie didn't know how to swim, whenever RJ and the children would be swimming around the boat, Natalie and Dennis would sit together and chat. She would tell him about her life, he would ask her for relationship advice with his long-term girlfriend. And so it wasn't that unusual that that Friday evening, Natalie and Dennis would sit together while she poured her heart out to him. Natalie apparently told him that she wanted to leave the island and go back home, that she wanted to call her sister and talk to her about whether or not she should leave RJ again. None of this really sounds that shady to me, but my only question is, why on earth did Christopher Walken decide to stay on the boat that night after Natalie and Dennis left? RJ apparently hated him, so surely that would have been the most awkward evening ever. The next morning, Natalie, still set on leaving the island, reportedly asked the motel receptionist about getting a seaplane off the island. This was a big deal because, as well as being afraid of water, Natalie was also terrified of flying. For one reason or another, a seaplane could not be made available, and Natalie didn't want to get a public boat back. Dennis convinced her that perhaps the best thing to do was just to go back to the boat and try and start afresh, and that's what they did. The group sailed away from Avalon at 11:30 a.m. on Saturday morning. They headed over to Two Harbours on the opposite side of the island, as RJ wanted to do some fishing. Two Harbours was a very small village, and there wasn't really a whole lot to do there. Natalie and Walken decided that they were going to take a boat taxi out to Doug's Harbour Reef, the only restaurant in the whole of Two Harbours. A little while later, RJ and Dennis decided that they would join them. When the two men walked into the restaurant, there sat Natalie and Walken, chatting and giggling to each other like a couple of schoolgirls. This, as you can imagine, did not make for a very comfortable environment for the rest of the evening. The waitress, a woman called Christina Quinn, later recalled how Natalie complained about almost everything that night. The lighting, the table, the food. She was just generally unhappy. The staff also recalled that RJ seemed to be simmering, ready to burst at any moment. When the group left the restaurant around 10 p.m, Natalie was extremely intoxicated. The restaurant's manager, a man called Don Whiting, actually called the harbour patrol when they left, as he was so concerned that they wouldn't be able to make it back to the boat safely because they were all so drunk. When they got back to the Splendor, Dennis put the kettle on for Natalie, as she always liked to have a cup of tea before bed. The men, however, had decided to have some more drinks. Seems like a great idea. And Dennis opened up another bottle of wine. The original story told to the police that night was that RJ and Walken had begun having a political debate, which had got a little heated. Around 11 p.m, Natalie had headed off to her room, as she was bored of all the political talk. The men talked for another hour or so, and then RJ headed down to his and Natalie's room to kiss her goodnight. When he entered, he realised that Natalie was missing. Even with this original story though, what happened next is just bizarre. Even though he noticed Natalie was missing at around midnight, RJ didn't call anyone for help until 1:30 a.m. And even then, it wasn't the Coast Guard he called. It was Don Whiting, the manager of Doug's Harbour Reef. Dennis claimed that he had gone down to Natalie and RJ's room and found RJ stood at the back of the boat. You know, where the steps are that you would climb down to get into the sea. RJ turned to him and said, "Natalie's missing. Why don't you go and look around the boat and see if you can find her?" Dennis thought it was odd, but did as he was told, searching, I believe, every room except for Christopher Walken's, where Walken had already retired for the night. When he couldn't find her, Dennis became incredibly alarmed. After all, if Natalie wasn't on the boat, there was only one place she could be. Dennis told RJ that they should call somebody, or at least try and search for her themselves. He turned the boat's searchlights on, but RJ quickly shut them off again, saying he didn't want to alert anyone because Natalie was a very high-profile actress, and the media would go into a frenzy over this. He poured himself and Dennis another drink, and insisted they sit down and have a think about what to do. Around 1:30 a.m, RJ contacted Don Whiting to ask him if Natalie was at the restaurant. He told him that Natalie had gone off in the dinghy on her own, and he believed she probably would have gone back to the restaurant, as she wanted to carry on drinking. This was weird, since the restaurant was shut, and would have been for hours by this point. Don told him that he didn't think she would be there, but he would go and check. Don and another local man called Paul Wintler gathered together a few local people, who all began searching around the village for Natalie, or any sign of the Valiant, the couple's inflatable dinghy, which was also missing. Both Don and Paul later said that RJ never told them that Natalie was afraid of water and didn't know how to swim, so they never thought it was odd that she would have headed out in the dinghy on her own. At 2:30 a.m, Don Whiting drove over to the home of the harbour master, a man called Doug Odin. Odin headed out to the Splendor and was surprised to find that the men on board did not seem overly panicked. They were just sitting around, drinking. He asked RJ a couple of questions about what had happened, and RJ told him that it was very out of character for Natalie to go out alone on the boat. This is a very important detail for later, as it completely juxtaposes the story his lawyer told police. The Coast Guard were finally called at 5:15 a.m, almost 5 hours since RJ had noticed Natalie was missing. Around 3 hours later, the dinghy was found, crushed up on the rocks inside a small cave in Blue Cavern Point. The engine was not running. In fact, the key was in the off position and the oars were still firmly locked in place. Then, around 8 a.m, Natalie was spotted by a helicopter. Her body was floating face down just below the surface of the water, around 1 mile away from the Splendor. She was wearing only a nightgown, a large red parka, and a pair of blue wool socks. RJ, Dennis and Walken were flown to Long Beach to be questioned by police. But before making any kind of statements, RJ requested that the 3 men be given a couple of minutes alone together. For some strange reason, probably because they were celebrities, this was actually allowed to happen. It's believed that during this time, RJ told the men what they should say, which unsurprisingly was not exactly the full truth. RJ told police that Natalie had gone to bed before them that night. She had complained previously about the sound that the dinghy made when the ropes came loose. It would bang against the side of the Splendor. He said that he believed that she had probably gone out there to retie the dinghy, as the noise was keeping her awake, and she must have slipped, fallen into the sea, and drowned. He told them that this was something that she did very often. It wasn't weird behaviour at all, which, as we all know by now, was a blatant lie. The lead detective on the case, a man called Dwayne Razier, said that RJ was so emotional in his interview that they had to terminate it early. He was happy to do this, as the explanation RJ had given him was totally satisfactory. RJ had only spoken with him for about 6 minutes. Less than 48 hours after Natalie's body was found, the autopsy results were released. The autopsy was conducted by LA County Coroner Thomas Noguchi, who at the time had gained himself a bit of a reputation. Noguchi had been on the scene for many celebrity deaths, including Sharon Tate and Marilyn Monroe. For a man involved in high-profile celebrity deaths, however, he wasn't exactly discreet. Noguchi had been slammed by many celebrities for revealing details about celebrity deaths that they would not have wanted made public. Noguchi's autopsy report revealed that Natalie had numerous bruises on her body, on her arms, legs, and a small abrasion on the left side of her face. She had a blood alcohol level of 0.14 and 2 drugs in her system, one for seasickness and the other a painkiller. These would have increased the effects of any alcohol she drank. He ruled the death as an accidental drowning. He believed that Natalie had been trying to board the dinghy, but had slipped due to her intoxicated state and was unable to get back on board. Her parka jacket had become wet and heavy, dragging her down, but Natalie hadn't thought to remove it due to her intoxicated state. The bruises on her body and the abrasion on her face were caused by her repeatedly slamming against the dinghy whilst trying to reboard it. The evidence he had to back this up is flimsy, to say the least. According to his book Coroner, that night Noguchi had sent out Senior Coroner's Office investigator and ocean accident specialist Paul Miller to investigate the circumstances around Natalie's death. Miller's report was never made public, but allegedly Miller noted scratch marks on the side of the dinghy that looked as if they had been made by fingernails. None of the witnesses at the scene, however, could back this claim up, and, very helpfully, Noguchi didn't scrape for DNA under Natalie's fingernails. If Natalie had scratched at the side of the dinghy, there most likely would have been traces of rubber under her fingernails, which could have been matched with the rubber that the dinghy was made of. But Noguchi never followed this up. Not long afterwards, Thomas Noguchi was fired, although it mainly seems like this was due to his inability to keep quiet about celebrity deaths, not because of a mistake he made in the Natalie Wood case. Many people believe, however, that due to increasing pressure and criticism from the public and from some very powerful celebrities, Noguchi rushed Natalie's case and came to the most obvious conclusion. In fact, Noguchi later told investigators who are currently working on the case that his autopsy was based on theory and not facts and evidence, meaning he went into it with a conclusion of what had happened and looked only for evidence that backed that story up. After Natalie's death, RJ told Dennis that he wasn't to speak to anyone about what had happened, and even hired him an attorney. But here's where it just gets weird. RJ asked Dennis if he could move in with him for a little while. Dennis agreed. He thought he was just being a friend, that he could be of some comfort to RJ and the children, whom he'd grown very close to over the years. This was not the case. The media, unsurprisingly, were all over this story, and RJ was not going to risk Dennis saying anything that could make him look guilty. He knew he could trust Christopher Walken. He had a career on the line. He wouldn't dare risk saying anything that could put that in jeopardy. But in comparison to them, Dennis was a nobody. What if someone offered him money to get an exclusive? RJ could lose everything. And so, Dennis's comforting break in RJ's home became more of a prison sentence. At first, it started out fine. Dennis had been living in a tiny apartment with a bunch of other men, so a big LA mansion was like a holiday home for him. RJ would ply him with alcohol to keep him happy. He even got him a job as an extra on Heart to Heart. But then, things turned ugly. Dennis was watched by bodyguards all the time. Whenever he would go to bed at night, his room had a magnetic lock on the door, meaning once he was in, he could not get out again until someone on the other side opened it for him. Dennis, at the time, as I mentioned, had a long-term girlfriend. After a long while, he finally managed to convince RJ to let him go and visit her. He was driven there by the bodyguards, and when he called and asked if he could stay the night at her place, he was told no. The bodyguards then showed up at his girlfriend's house and dragged him by the neck and threw him into the car. Dennis was held prisoner in RJ's home for over a year before he was finally allowed to leave. And when he did leave, RJ handed him a check for $6,000 in an attempt to buy his silence. That was the last time RJ and Dennis ever spoke. Lana Wood and Maria were also completely shut out by RJ afterwards. Though RJ continued to raise Natalie's children, including Natasha, who was not biologically his, Maria and Lana were no longer allowed to see them. Natasha claims that it all started after Natalie's will was carried out. Lana had been allocated all of Natalie's expensive clothes and shoes. At the time, Lana was living in a small apartment with her daughter. Though she wanted to keep the clothes as a reminder of her beloved sister, she just simply did not have the space for them all, and she really needed the money. She ended up selling almost all of it. RJ bashed her in the press for it, basically trying to make her feel guilty by calling her a terrible person for selling all of her sister's belongings. Natasha Gregson more recently has said that this was the last straw for the family, and from then on, Lana was no longer welcome in the home. Lana claims that she still feels incredibly guilty for doing it, but she had no other choice. And then she claims RJ did something far worse. He put up for auction loads of Natalie's belongings, including personal letters and photos. Years before Natalie's death, she had also purchased an apartment for her mother to live in. In her will, there were strict instructions to ensure that Maria would be able to continue living in the home Natalie had bought for her. RJ, however, didn't care what was in the will. He claimed that the apartment was far too large for Maria and kicked her out so that his daughter Katie could live there instead. Then, to make it even worse, if that's even possible, he hired Maria to answer all of his fan mail, giving her a monthly salary of only $2,000 for doing so. As I mentioned, Lana Wood was also an actress, but around this time she was having real trouble getting any jobs in Hollywood, either in production or as an actress, and she couldn't understand why. She was then contacted by a man called Roland Perkins, a founder of the Creative Arts Agency, one of the most powerful Hollywood talent agencies. He told her that she should stop trying to get a job in Hollywood, that it was never going to happen for her, because she had been blacklisted. By who, you ask? By Robert Wagner. Not much happened in the case for a while after this. For the police, it was open and shut. Natalie had accidentally drowned, that's all. It wasn't until 2011 when there were updates on this case. Dennis decided that he'd had enough and came forward with his side of the story, what he claims is the actual truth. Dennis said that that night the argument on board the boat had not, in fact, been just a political debate. He claimed that the three had been arguing about Natalie's career. RJ was complaining that Natalie was away from her family too often because of her career as an actress, and so she should quit to focus on them. Walken had come to her defence, saying that Natalie was an incredible actress and that travelling was just part of the job. RJ was not happy about Walken trying to defend Natalie, and so he picked up a wine bottle and smashed it, shouting, "What are you trying to do? Fuck my wife?" Walken quickly left the room and went down to his own cabin. In fact, police had noticed that there was a broken bottle of wine on the boat that night. RJ's explanation was that the water had been very choppy that night, and the bottle had fallen off the counter and smashed. Dennis claims that after this, Natalie stormed off to her room and RJ followed her. Dennis turned on some loud music as he didn't want the couple to think he was eavesdropping on them, but he said he could still hear them ever so slightly. He went down to check on them, knocking on the door to ask if everything was okay. RJ replied, "Go away." A little while later, everything went quiet, and so Dennis decided to go down and check on them once more. When he opened the door to their room, no one was in there. He opened the door to the back of the boat, and that's where he found RJ, stood, as I said before, by the steps that led down into the sea. Dennis claimed that he was scared of RJ and didn't want to go against his employer, which is why he hadn't come forward with his story until now. And, interestingly enough, despite the fact that RJ had told the police that there had been no real argument whatsoever that night, and that the bottle of wine had smashed because of the rough seas, in his own memoir, Pieces of My Heart, he actually changed his story, confirming that he had indeed smashed the bottle whilst they were all having a fight. In November of 2011, thanks to Dennis's new testimony, the case was reopened. In 2012, a new coroner's report was issued, and Natalie's cause of death was changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. Though the report stated that Natalie had drowned, likely not long after she entered the water, it also noted that it had not been clearly established how exactly she had ended up in the water. Also noted was that when Natalie's body had been found, she had quite a lot of urine in her bladder. This was unusual because typically when someone drowns, they void their bladder, as in they pee. This suggests that perhaps Natalie was unconscious when she hit the water. After the investigation was reopened, new witnesses also came forward. John and Marilyn Wayne, owners of a boat called the Capricorn, were anchored about 80 feet away from the Splendor that night. Around 11 p.m, Marilyn was awoken by John. He asked her if she could hear a woman calling for help. Marilyn went out onto the deck where she confirmed that she could hear a woman repeatedly shouting, "Help me, somebody help me, I'm drowning." She said that they could also hear two men calling back to the woman in a rather mocking manner, saying stuff like, yeah, we're gonna help you." She claimed that the shouting went on from 11:05 until 11:25 and then it stopped. She claimed that they tried to call the harbour patrol about 10 times, but no one ever picked up. She also claimed that her and her husband had tried to tell the police about this at the time, but that they weren't interested. Another man called Warren Archer also came forward to say that he was moored near the Splendor that night too, only 30 yards away. Archer was actually friends with Natalie and RJ and claimed that at about 11 p.m. he had called RJ over the radio to ask if he and Natalie wanted to come over to his boat because they were having a party. Archer also claimed that he could hear noises in the background, which would suggest that him and Natalie were fighting when he called. He also said that he noticed that the dinghy was still tied to the Splendor at this time. On January 14th, 2013, the LA County Coroner's Office released a 10-page addendum to the original autopsy report. This addendum concluded that Natalie may have actually sustained some of the bruises on her body before she even entered the water. Ralph Hernandez, the lead detective on the case, publicly commented that Natalie looked like the victim of an assault. Since the case was reopened, RJ has steadfastly refused to cooperate with police. The last time he was interviewed by police regarding this case was on October 4th, 1981. Christopher Walken, however, has cooperated completely. In 2019, Natalie's daughter Natasha produced a documentary for HBO all about her mother, called Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind. Natasha strongly believes that her stepfather had nothing to do with her mother's death, calling the idea preposterous. There are many different theories on what really occurred on the boat that night. Some people believe that during their argument, RJ deliberately pushed Natalie off the boat, knowing she could not swim and would therefore drown. Others think that perhaps he didn't intend to kill Natalie, but he still made no effort to help her get back on board the boat after he had angrily pushed her in the sea or she had fallen in. Some even speculate that Natalie had caught RJ having an affair with none other than Christopher Walken. RJ had then killed her, either to stop her from outing him to the public or just out of anger at being rumbled for cheating once again. Weirdly enough, there is some evidence to back this up. One of the lifeguards on the scene that night, a man called Roger Smith, had to write up a report about what had happened. On the bottom of his report, it was noted that Walken and RJ had been involved with sexual activity and Natalie had discovered it. This note, however, was in completely different handwriting to the rest of the report, and Smith says that he did not write it. He claims that it could have been perhaps written by the other lifeguard on duty that night, but no one knows who that person was. Dennis has addressed this rumour, saying he doesn't think this is likely at all. The other theories both exonerate RJ completely, concluding that Natalie accidentally drowned. One theory is that Natalie, having already decided she'd had enough of the trip the night before, had decided that she was going to leave in the dinghy on her own that night, find somewhere on the island to stay, and then head home the next morning. The other is what RJ has always claimed, that Natalie tried to retie the dinghy to the boat and fell in. Lana Wood claims that Natalie would have never gone to shore in her nightgown. She said, Natalie would not go anywhere not fully made up, wearing something terrific. She certainly would not get in a dinghy in her nightgown by herself. She would get dressed up, put on full makeup, and have Dennis DeVerne take her ashore to stay in a motel on Catalina, which is exactly what she did the night before when she wanted to leave. Dennis has also said the same thing, that if Natalie wanted to leave, she would have got him to take her. As well as this, the headlight on the dinghy wasn't actually working that weekend, which Natalie would have known. The Friday night, when they were returning to the boat, RJ had to hold a flashlight whilst Dennis controlled the dinghy. Natalie wouldn't have been able to steer the dinghy and hold a flashlight at the same time. She would have been completely blind if she'd gone out there on her own. And Natalie, with her debilitating fear of water, would never have done something like that, even if she was drunk. And that's about the end of the case. Blimey, that was a long one. Anyway, please let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments below. I would love to hear your theories. As I mentioned, this case was actually requested, so if you've got any cases you want to see me cover, then please comment them below as well. If you enjoyed this video, then please do give it a like and subscribe if you want to see more like it. If you want to follow me on any of my social medias, they will be linked in the description down below, along with all the sources that I used for this video if you fancy some extra reading. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time with a video I am very excited for. Bye!